Before we dive into the story, I need to ask you for a quick but incredibly important favor. Please take 1 second to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and leave any comment below. Your engagement tells YouTube's algorithms that this content deserves to be seen, and it helps more people discover these real-life horror stories. So please, subscribe, like, and comment. I am genuinely grateful for your support. Now, let me take you into a nightmare that began in the beautiful mountains of Colorado. In the late afternoon of October 23, 2011, the silence of a 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of Loveland was shattered by the sound of the front door swinging open. A woman walked in under the blinding fluorescent lights. Her clothes were nothing but dirty rags. Her face was covered with old bruises and fresh scratches. She could barely stand. Each step caused her excruciating pain, and both of her hands were convulsively clutching her huge belly. She was in the final months of her pregnancy. The gas station employees rushed to her side and immediately called emergency services. A few hours later, at the local hospital, the police were frozen in shock while taking the unknown woman's fingerprints. The database produced a match that was almost unbelievable. Lying in the hospital bed in front of them was Josephine Smith, a 31-year-old woman who had vanished without a trace exactly 2 years earlier, just a few dozen miles away on a deserted stretch of Highway 36. Back then, search teams had found only her locked silver car and an unsolved mystery. All that time, investigators and her family thought she was dead. But she had returned, exhausted, terrified, and not alone. What Josephine told the detectives that night would reveal a story of survival so terrifying that even common sense would refuse to believe it. Let me take you back to the fall of 2009. Rocky Mountain National Park greeted visitors with cold winds and heavy, leaden skies. On September 14th at 7:15 in the morning, CCTV cameras at the main entrance captured a silver Mercedes. The driver was 31-year-old Josephine Smith, a senior auditor for a financial company. This short vacation was supposed to be an emotional reboot, a chance to escape the city's hustle. At 8 a.m., she parked at the Bear Lake trailhead. According to the official tourist log, at 8:10 she signed in and chose the Emerald Lake Trail, a popular, relatively safe route about 3.5 miles round trip. The weather that morning was stable, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, with no precipitation. Other hikers confirmed seeing her. A retired couple from Ohio told police they saw a woman matching her description near the lake at about 10:30 a.m. She appeared calm, took many photos of the mountain scenery, and did not talk to anyone. At 12:45 p.m., parking lot surveillance cameras recorded Josephine returning to her silver Mercedes, putting a small backpack in the back seat, getting behind the wheel, and leaving. At 1 p.m., her car passed through the park's southern exit. She had successfully completed her hike. Her next stop was a pre-booked room at the Whispering Pines Lodge, a mountain hotel 15 miles from the park's exit. The hotel manager later told detectives that the reservation was confirmed for 2 p.m., and the room was ready, but the guest never showed up. Around 6 p.m., Josephine's parents and close friends began to sound the alarm. All attempts to call her failed. Her phone was out of range. She did not check in at the hotel, which was completely out of character for her meticulous nature. At 9 p.m., her family officially filed a missing person report. The next morning, September 15th, at 6:40 a.m., a patrol crew spotted the silver Mercedes on the side of a deserted stretch of Highway 36. The car was parked at a slight angle, as if the driver had braked hard and driven onto the gravel. The dense coniferous forest around it was eerily silent. The car was locked, with no visible damage. Inside, on the passenger seat, lay Josephine's leather purse with her driver's license, 3 credit cards, and $240 in cash. The ignition keys were in the lock, but the engine was off. A tourist backpack with an unfinished bottle of water and a professional digital camera sat neatly on the back seat. Forensic experts found no signs of a struggle, blood, or violence either inside the car or within 100 feet of it. Josephine seemed to have evaporated, leaving her entire life locked inside a metal box. On September 16th, one of the largest search operations in county history was launched. More than 80 police officers, rangers, and volunteers began methodically combing the Roosevelt National Forest adjacent to Highway 36. Search dogs picked up Josephine's scent near the driver's door, walked about 20 feet along the asphalt roadside, and then abruptly stopped, confused by the loss of the trail. For experienced detectives, this was a clear signal. Josephine had not gone into the woods on foot. She had gotten into, or been forced into, another vehicle right there on the highway. Helicopters with thermal imagers flew daily for 3 weeks over more than 150 square miles of mountainous terrain. Ground teams checked old logging roads and deep ravines. Divers searched the icy bottoms of 2 nearby lakes. Hundreds of hours of surveillance footage from nearby gas stations were reviewed frame by frame. All of these superhuman efforts were completely in vain. Not a single piece of her clothing or a trace of her hiking shoes was ever found. Josephine Smith's case gradually became hopeless. Detectives checked dozens of potential suspects but rejected theories of a wild animal attack or a fatal accident. They were no closer to solving the case. Investigators were already preparing documents to officially declare her dead, not realizing that the real, unimaginable horror of this story was still waiting to happen. Exactly 2 years passed. On October 23, 2011, the night shift at the Loaf N Jug gas station on the deserted outskirts of Loveland passed uneventfully. Outside, a cold autumn wind raged, whipping rain against the windows. The temperature had plummeted to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. At 11:45 p.m., the night cashier, 22-year-old Mark Davis, was wiping down the coffee machine when the monotonous silence was broken by the sharp crash of the automatic glass door. Someone had forced their way in, literally breaking the metal flaps with their body. A woman fell under the blinding white light. Her appearance caused instant paralyzing horror. She was completely barefoot. Her feet were covered with deep, bloody cuts, dried mud, and small sharp stones. Instead of normal clothes, she wore shapeless, tattered rags, a dirty men's flannel shirt several sizes too big, and worn sweatpants torn at the knees. Her once well-groomed dark hair was tangled into a stiff mat of dried leaves, pine needles, and small branches. Her face was pale as chalk and covered with a dense network of fresh scratches and old yellowish bruises. But the most frightening detail was her huge belly. She was definitely in the final months of pregnancy. The woman took only 3 unsteady steps across the sales floor before her exhausted legs gave way, and she fell heavily to the cold tiles. With both torn arms, she clutched her stomach, instinctively protecting it, and gasped for air with loud wheezes. Mark Davis rushed to his office phone and dialed 911 at 11:48 p.m. In the recording, the cashier describes in a panicked, trembling voice a wounded pregnant woman in deep shock, unable to utter a single articulate word. Paramedics arrived in just 7 minutes. The woman was carefully transferred to a stretcher. Her vital signs were critical: heart rate 130 beats per minute, blood pressure 80/50, body temperature dangerously low at 95 degrees Fahrenheit. She was put on oxygen and rushed to the nearest medical center in Loveland. In the brightly lit intensive care unit, doctors fought desperately to save 2 lives at once. The local police began their work as well. Since the patient had no documents or personal belongings and was semi-conscious, a patrol officer followed standard identification protocol. At 2:15 a.m., using a portable digital scanner, he took her fingerprints and uploaded the data to the national database. The result came back in just 14 minutes. The officer froze in shock as he looked at the illuminated screen. The prints were a 100% match for Josephine Smith, the same woman whose large-scale search had been called off months ago, whose name had long appeared on the grim lists of those presumed dead in the Colorado mountains. She was now 33 years old, but her extreme emaciation and injuries indicated she had suffered horrific, inhuman conditions for all that time. This incredible news brought the entire senior management of the local detective department to their feet. At 4 a.m., 2 senior investigators rushed to the intensive care unit. They were mentally prepared to see a broken victim with deep amnesia or someone who had completely lost touch with reality. But as the effects of the stabilizing drugs began to wear off, Josephine slowly opened her eyes. Her gaze was incredibly clear, cold, and focused. Clutching the edge of the white hospital sheet with one hand, while the other continued to protect her pregnant belly, she looked directly into the eyes of the stunned detectives. In a thin voice, broken by long silence but carrying an iron will, she began to give her first official testimony. What the experienced officers would hear over the next few hours would make them shudder, as every word formed a terrifying puzzle of a methodical, brutal plan to completely destroy another person's life. Josephine named a name from the past, Richard Wallace. This was a man she had crossed paths with only once in her life, many years earlier, without ever realizing the fatal role he would play in her fate. Investigators immediately pulled up old archives. Their only meeting took place in the spring of 2005. At that time, Josephine was a senior auditor for a large consulting firm. She was sent to conduct an independent audit of the financial department of a construction company where Richard held a senior management position. Her audit report was incredibly hard and dry, leaving no room for excuses. She found serious financial discrepancies. The consequences were catastrophic for Wallace. He was publicly accused of large-scale fraud, though he was only indirectly involved through the negligence of his subordinates. The ruthless corporate machine destroyed his life. He lost his prestigious job, his bank accounts were frozen due to lawsuits, and his debts accumulated rapidly. Soon after, his wife could not stand the pressure and filed for divorce, taking their young child and moving to another state, cutting all ties forever. Richard found himself at absolute rock bottom, and for many years in that oppressive darkness, he harbored only one maniacal thought: to take brutal revenge on the woman who had wiped out everything he loved with one stroke of her pen. Wallace spent months studying her habits and daily routes. He knew that on that fall day, she would be heading alone to the mountain park. On the fateful evening, the highway was eerily quiet. Josephine saw an old, dirty pickup truck with its hood open on the narrow roadside ahead. The driver was waving his arms, begging for help. It was a classic trap. The car was parked at an angle that blocked the narrow lane, forcing her Mercedes to slow down. As soon as she braked and lowered her window slightly to ask what had happened, the man rushed to her door. It all happened in a split second. Richard acted with lightning speed, pressing a thick rag soaked in chloroform against her face with brute force. Josephine tried to fight back, but the toxic fumes quickly paralyzed her. The world blurred into a pitch-black abyss. The last thing she felt was someone's strong arms pulling her out into the cold mountain night. When consciousness slowly returned through a dull, throbbing pain, she felt a hard metal surface under her back. Absolute, deafening darkness surrounded her, and the stale air reeked of stagnant dust. Her wrists were securely tied with plastic ties. But the worst part was something else. The walls around her were vibrating softly, and the floor shook from time to time due to uneven asphalt. She realized with primal horror that her cramped prison was not standing still. It was moving very fast through the endless night, carrying her toward an inescapable hell. Richard Wallace was far more cautious than typical criminals. He knew that any real estate would leave a paper trail, and neighbors might hear screams. So he did not bury Josephine in a remote mansion. The place of her 2-year imprisonment was a mobile, fully autonomous prison on wheels, an old but sturdy motorhome. He had purchased it for cash under a false name months before the crime and spent hundreds of hours upgrading it internally. In the very back of the van, behind a sturdy fake wooden partition, he built a tiny, isolated compartment with his own hands. The space was so small, about 4 by 6 feet, that Josephine could not straighten up or take more than 2 full steps. This makeshift cell had no windows. The walls, ceiling, and floor were covered with professional soundproofing and dark acoustic foam, so her screams were completely absorbed. The only source of fresh oxygen was a narrow metal ventilation pipe built into the roof. In summer, hot air flowed through it, turning the cell into an oven. In winter, the piercing mountain cold penetrated freely, with only a thick woolen blanket for protection. Light was turned on only when the kidnapper wanted it. The most terrifying aspect was the constant, endless movement. Wallace was maniacally afraid of being followed, so he almost never stayed in one place for more than a few days. Sometimes the van would hide for weeks in abandoned campsites deep in the Arapaho National Forest, where there was an eerie dead silence. Other times, he would brazenly park at noisy truck stops, where Josephine could hear the voices of people passing just inches away. But the physical ordeal was only part of Richard's plan. He did not just want to keep her in dark captivity. He wanted to systematically destroy her personality, break her psyche, and force her to endure the unbearable pain that had once destroyed his own life. Every day, the same gruesome psychological ritual began. He would open the cell door and place a video player in front of her, forcing her to watch old home movies of his destroyed family, where he was a happy father. After the video, the most severe torture would begin. He would throw a thick paper folder into her lap, a copy of the very same audit report she had written years ago. Under threat of brutal violence, he forced her to read it out loud, page after page. Her own dry, uncompromising text now sounded like a harsh indictment of herself. He demanded that after each paragraph, she look him straight in the eye and admit her absolute guilt for his broken fate and destroyed career. Day after day, this ruthless psychological terror produced its devastating results. Trapped in oppressive darkness, forever losing track of time and space, Josephine began to slowly lose touch with objective reality. Her brain, exhausted by constant stress, refused to resist. It seemed Richard had completely achieved his painful goal. The former confident career woman had turned into a broken shadow. This horrific routine could have gone on for years with impunity, if one morning Josephine had not felt a completely atypical change in her own body. In the 4th month of her imprisonment, she began to notice changes. Constant nausea, paralyzing weakness, physical transformations that could not be ignored. Even without medical tests or a calendar, she realized with cold horror the terrible truth. She was pregnant by her tormentor. Richard's reaction was the most chilling episode of the entire case. When she confessed her condition, trembling with primal fear, she expected fits of blind rage or physical violence. Instead, his face lit up with a perverse manic euphoria. For him, this was the absolute perfect culmination of his sick plan for revenge. He said that she had taken his child away from him years ago, destroying his marriage, and now she would give birth to a new child who would grow up exclusively with him. From that moment, the cramped, soundproof compartment turned into a mobile incubator. The dynamics changed dramatically. Wallace stopped beating her and ended the hours-long sessions of reading documents, panicking that she might miscarry. But this sudden change did not bring Josephine any relief. Her brain, hardened by years of stressful work, began to work with cold, mathematical precision. She clearly realized her new fatal status. She was now just a temporary biological vessel. As soon as the child was born, she would no longer be needed. Richard would simply take the baby and bury her body deep in an unmarked pit. Her life was guaranteed to end on the exact day of delivery. To survive, Josephine developed an incredibly complex psychological strategy. She began to skillfully simulate deep Stockholm syndrome. This required superhuman emotional effort. Every day, she forced herself to portray absolute obedience, deep understanding, and even painful affection for her executioner. She stopped crying and begging for freedom. Instead, she asked Richard about his past, nodded sympathetically at his manic monologues about the injustice of the world, and imitated sincere remorse for her role in his ruin. She methodically convinced him that they could indeed become a real family for the unborn child. This impeccable acting on the edge of human capability began to produce the first barely noticeable results. Around the 6th month of pregnancy, Wallace's vigilance cracked. Realizing the child needed nutrients, he was forced to leave the safe, remote forest campsites more often and approach civilization. He regularly visited small pharmacies and farmers markets, buying expensive prenatal vitamins, fresh vegetables, quality meat, and specific medications. Each stop was a huge risk, and his inflamed nervous system quickly exhausted itself. Believing Josephine had finally accepted her fate and sincerely cared about their future baby, he began to make small but critical mistakes. He stopped tying her wrists tightly with plastic ties every night. Sometimes, when the motorhome was speeding along deserted highways, he even left the inner door of her cell open, allowing her to breathe fresher air from the front cabin. Josephine sat dutifully in the corner, gently stroking her stomach and talking softly to her baby, while her eyes scanned every inch of space, memorizing the exact location of heavy metal objects and construction tools. She knew her physical strength was rapidly melting away, and her due date was inexorably approaching. She needed only one chance, one fatal mistake by her captor. That moment came with the cold autumn front that covered the mountains of Larimer County on October 23, 2011. An early snowstorm forced the old motorhome to stop on a completely deserted logging road deep in the forest, surrounded by dense, impenetrable conifers. Richard tried to wait out the bad weather, but the old generator suddenly jammed. The loud humming that Josephine had grown accustomed to stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Irritated by the cold, Wallace went outside to make emergency repairs. In his haste, he made the only critical mistake of his entire crime. He left the heavy metal ignition keys on a plastic table in the front passenger compartment. He also left the cell door ajar. Josephine heard dull metal strikes outside, followed by her captor's loud scream. He had injured his right hand on a frozen generator shaft, cutting his palm deeply. She realized this was the one and only chance she had been waiting for. Overcoming terrible physical pain in her lower back, she slipped silently out of her cell. Her bare feet touched the icy linoleum. Her eyes instantly caught two things: the keys on the desk and a heavy 18-inch long adjustable wrench that Richard had left behind after repairing the pipes that morning. Josephine gripped the cold metal with both hands. She hid in the thick shade behind the front door, holding her breath. A few minutes later, the motorhome door creaked open. Richard struggled up the stairs, cursing furiously, blood dripping thickly from his torn hand onto the floor. He was disoriented by the pain and did not look around. Josephine put all her hatred, all her pent-up despair, and her instinct to protect her unborn child into one movement. She stepped sharply out of the darkness and struck a crushing blow with the wrench directly to the back of his head. A dull crunch sounded. Wallace staggered, but his strong physique and thick jacket partially softened the blow. He did not lose consciousness instantly. He turned, his eyes filled with animal fury. A bloody struggle ensued between the frail pregnant woman and the extremely dangerous man. He tried to grab her throat with his left hand, but she threw another furious punch, hitting him in the shoulder. Blood splattered the walls and the table. The incredible adrenaline rush gave her superhuman strength. When Wallace stumbled on the blood-slick floor, she pushed him with both hands in the chest. His body lost balance and fell through the open door onto the frozen gravel. Josephine immediately closed the metal door and turned the internal lock. She grabbed the keys with trembling fingers and rushed to the driver's seat. But her hands shook so badly that she could not insert the key into the ignition several times. When she finally did, the old engine coughed and stalled. At the same moment, a terrible bang came from outside. Richard had regained consciousness and began furiously beating his fists against the door. Staying inside was deadly. Realizing the van was about to become her coffin again, Josephine made the most difficult decision. She opened the side door on the driver's side and jumped out into the icy darkness of the forest. She did not look back. She ran instinctively into the thicket, wading through thorny bushes that mercilessly tore at her skin. She walked for hours, completely losing track of time. Her bare feet quickly became one continuous wound from sharp stones. Her limbs felt almost nothing from the cold, and her large stomach cramped with spasms. Nothing surrounded her but eerie shadows and the howling wind. It seemed to be the final end of her journey. But suddenly, somewhere far ahead through the noise of the trees, she heard a quiet but welcome sound: the hum of car tires on wet asphalt. She gathered the last of her energy and headed toward it. When the bright neon sign of a 24-hour gas station flashed ahead like a ghostly beacon, she made her last dash toward the light. On October 24, 2011, at 3 a.m., a police tactical team arrived at the deserted logging road. Josephine's testimony had given them the exact coordinates. In the darkness, the silhouette of the old motorhome appeared. It was empty. On the frozen ground near the driver's door, a pool of not yet frozen blood stood out. Inside, the chaos of the struggle was everywhere. The floor covered in crimson stains, and in the middle lay the heavy 18-inch steel wrench, the weapon with which the pregnant woman had fought for her right to live. Behind the false panel, investigators found the tiny soundproofed cell. The air was heavy with the smell of despair and medicine. On a narrow shelf, they found neatly folded diaries belonging to Richard Wallace. In these notebooks, the maniac had meticulously recorded every day of the abuse, schedules for taking prenatal vitamins, and notes about her condition. Nearby were maps of Colorado with dozens of isolated forest campsites circled in red marker. But Richard was not there. Fresh traces of blood led deep into the brush. A search operation with canine units was launched. The dogs confidently picked up the trail, which broke about 2.5 miles south of the motorhome at a small poacher's camp. Two frightened men told police that an unknown man covered in mud and blood had come to their campfire about an hour ago, brutally beaten one of them, stolen their powerful hunting ATV, and fled south. A patrol helicopter with infrared thermal imaging was launched. 15 minutes later, The operator picked up a red heat spot moving rapidly along a dirt road toward an old granite quarry called Arkin's Quarry, a place with steep cliffs over 250 feet deep, a perfect natural trap with no safe escape route. Police quickly blocked the only exit, deploying spike tapes and armored vehicles. Richard drove the ATV at high speed onto the cleared quarry site and was forced to brake. The road ahead was completely blocked by dozens of tactical unit soldiers with their weapons trained on him. He tried to turn around, but only sheer granite cliffs rose on the sides. The commander ordered him to turn off the engine and raise his hands. But the bloody beast, driven to a stone dead end, understood perfectly that his long-standing plan of revenge had fallen apart, and now only the cold abyss awaited him. At 5 a.m. on October 24, 2011, the final act began. Richard Wallace stood just 2 steps from the edge of a 250-foot cliff. His clothes were wet, muddy rags. His face contorted in animal fury. Blood oozed from a deep gash on his head and a torn right palm. He looked like a cornered predator who realized the hunt was over but refused to accept defeat. The commander gave a clear order over the loudspeaker. "Raise your hands, step away from the edge, and slowly kneel down." But Wallace had no intention of surrendering. He waved his arms frantically, screaming curses against the judicial system and Josephine personally. He fanatically demanded that the police open fire, trying to provoke a suicide by cop. He wanted a quick death to avoid a public trial and long prison sentence. But law enforcement was not going to give him such an easy way out. Instead of a kill command, the head of the operation ordered the use of non-lethal weapons. In fractions of a second, 3 assault team members closed the distance. Several dull pops were heard. Heavy rubber bullets hit his chest and legs, followed by powerful stun guns. Wallace's body jerked convulsively from the electric current. His muscles instantly paralyzed, and he fell heavily onto the wet granite, not having taken the fatal step into the abyss. Special Forces soldiers immediately pounced on him and fastened heavy steel handcuffs on his wrists. Richard Wallace was taken alive. Now he would face an inevitable trial for the 2 years of hell he had inflicted. Meanwhile, a few dozen miles away in the warm intensive care unit of Loveland Medical Center, a very different battle was being fought. 2 armed policemen stood guard at the door. Inside, a team of 4 doctors and 3 experienced nurses helped bring new life into the world. The enormous stress of the bloody fight, hypothermia, and hours of running through the night forest had triggered Josephine's premature labor. Her body, critically exhausted by long captivity, poor nutrition, and complete lack of sunlight, demonstrated superhuman willpower. She had fought through the pitch darkness, and now her absolute goal was to bring her baby into the world. After several hours of hard work, at 7:20 a.m., the silence of the sterile hospital space was broken by the loud crying of a baby. Despite all the terrible ordeal, Josephine gave birth to a perfectly healthy baby girl, weighing 6 pounds and 5 ounces. As the nurse gently placed the baby, wrapped in a warm blanket, on Josephine's chest, she cried for the first time in 2 years. These were hot tears of undeniable victory over evil. She had survived. She had broken the system of her executioner with her own hands, escaped from the mobile cage, and handed him over to justice. She had regained her stolen life and physical freedom. But looking at the small face of her newborn daughter, Josephine knew that the main test of her life was just beginning. Ahead lay many years of difficult rehabilitation, traumatic testimony in court where she would have to face her tormentor, and a return to a society that had long mourned her death. But the most important task was different. She had to find boundless reserves of love and wisdom in herself to raise this child with dignity. A girl in whose veins would forever flow the blood of Richard Wallace, the man who had tried to destroy her, but paradoxically gave her the strongest incentive in the world to live on.